when I look around, I notice that infighting is the way that big companies and perhaps the government gets us to forget about who's really responsible and the cause for a lot of problems that we face in the world today. I mean, just think about a lot of the problems that we have in society and who gets the blame for them. We have spoken before about the divide between rich people and poor people, which is really probably the main divide. But I don't mean rich people. You know, I've said this before. The guy driving around in a Porsche 911 is not rich. The guy driving around in a Ferrari is not actually probably rich. These are signs of wealth traditionally, but if you've got 100 grand to spend on a car, you're probably not rich in the grand scale of the world. And people think that sounds stupid, but actually have a think about it. If a man or a woman has got 10 million and decides to buy a Ferrari, that's great, but they've done well for themselves. If someone has 100 million, well, that's not even that far. It's the people in the world that have billions who are the real runners of the world. Someone who's living in London and who's made a decent career for themselves, maybe they've benefited from the corruption or the trickle down or perhaps trickle up economic model that we're seeing in a lot of the world now. But at the end of the day, they might be a product of the circumstances, but they're not the cause, right? So I don't think that we should blame these people. And again, young people versus old people. This is the biggest one I see in today's market, absolutely. I see young people versus old people all the time. That is a weird car. Old American truck. Yeah, young people versus old people is basically poised as the biggest one at the minute. This whole boomer thing, right? It's the boomers' fault that we can't buy a property. It's their fault that all of this sort of stuff. And you may argue it's because of the economic policies that they voted for. Yes, it's probably true, but let's face it, since then there's been our parents' generation and our generation as well. It's not the individual's fault to blame. Don't blame old Derek for not wanting to sell his council house for the reason why you have not been able to get yourself a place. It's not entirely his fault, or it's not necessarily his fault, because just like you're following the path that you're told to, these people generally follow the path that they were told to, perhaps to better avail, maybe not, we'll see. But they've not done anything wrong. The real people to blame is the people who have been very opposed to house building. And people might say, well, that's got something to do with the older people themselves, but think about why people are encouraged to vote in certain things or vote certain ways. Oftentimes it's to the benefit and by the I'd say manipulation, for want of a better word, manipulation of big companies, right? They're told to buy into an ideology and a mindset because of what big companies want. And by the way, that's less opinion and more proven facts. Look at how certain companies in the past have influenced not just small level things, but arguably societal changes. I'm not saying these companies are necessarily bad, but have you ever noticed how everyone calls it sellotape, for example? That's a brand, right? Velcro, that's a brand. Brands can do a lot of things to the world. I'm not using those as examples of evil, but here's my point, right? Stop blaming the old people, right? Think about your grandparents. They've not done anything wrong. My grandparents, all they ever did is follow the path. They got a good job, they got the education to get a good job, and they bought a house. It's not their fault that I can't buy a house. And by the way, you still can if you really wanted to, but that's an entirely different topic and a video that I made just a bit ago. But no, don't blame them. It's not their fault, the older people. The real fault of whom you should be blaming is the people who want to see property prices rise. The fact as well that the government has not really built the new houses to accommodate for population growth. And that's another thing, right? Population growth. It's another place where people like to blame basically people who come here for a better life, right? If people stop coming here, then we'd all have property. Well, at what detriment to the economy, right? At what detriment to public services and etc. This is where people are going wrong. All of the blame gets put on the wrong people. Now, it might be the fault of a certain demographic. I don't know. It depends on what we're talking about, right? Maybe old people living in 4-bedroom houses is a reason why, that, for example. But here's the thing at the same time, right? That's the product, not the cause. Again, it's a product, not the cause. Don't blame the old people for doing what they were told to do. Blame the government for telling them to do it, telling them not to move, and incentivize them to stay there, right? It's really their fault more than, I think, the fault of, let's say, the individual. as individuals, we have freedom, and I always like to make a counter argument. I just made a video earlier today where I spoke about the fact that people should not blame the government for all of their faults and problems. But at the same time, look, where do we go here with this topic? Because this is a very interesting one, I think. The problem is, in today's society, we are poised or positioned to go at each other, right? Young people should hate old people. This societal class should hate that societal class. People from this background should... And that's not the case. We're all in this together, right? If you live in the UK or the US or whatever, we're all in this together. We're all working people who try our best and want decent things for ourselves and our families. A lot of people come here for a better life. They pay into the system, etc. You know, we're all in the same system together. We're all trying to get the same thing. Don't look to each other, I'd say, as the fault, maybe as a product of the situation, but not as the cause, I'd say. And I think that's where everyone's going wrong, right? I think it's where everyone is going wrong. Because when people feel that they can't have a position of something, it creates a degree of maybe envy, maybe hatred or resentment. And I feel like the people who are in charge of all this know that. And it's just like when we spoke about inflation. If we say inflation is simply we're putting the prices up, that sounds evil. If we give it this floaty term of inflation, well, then you're going to be less mad. It's inflation, guys. Another one is this whole positioning of hatred, I think. Like, but by looking at each other down here, nobody's looking up there at what's actually going on. And that is the big question. That's the big point, I think. What's happening? What's actually happening and why? Not necessarily I don't want to know about the consequences directly. I want to know about the why and the what. What is actually happening? Because people claim to know and they don't. They don't know what's happening. They don't understand the reasons and the consequences of it long term. Let's actually ask the meaningful questions, and then we might get some real answers. I'm not saying that the government is to blame for everything. A lot of people like to make this argument because, again, it absolves them of all guilt and responsibilities, but that's also not true. It's also just not the case. There's a nice balance in factuality between both sides of things, and two things can be wrong or right at the same time, right? So, is all of the old people maybe holding all the homes helping young people to buy? Probably not. But are the policies against building houses encouraging growth in housing? Also probably not. And I feel like it's something that we're losing in the world at the minute. The ability to have a balanced chat. You know, it's like people subscribe to an ideology and nothing can come in between them and it. Like, if I believe certain things about the world and someone proved it to be opposite to the truth, let's have a chat about it. But less and less people are willing to have a chat about it. It's more about, well, I'm subscribed to an ideology and you're not amongst it. Let's just not talk at all. It's a worrying place.